the cage that could not hold him. "Say it again." "I said I won't kneel." "You understand what happens if you refuse a third time." "I understood the first two." The voice that answered was calm in a way that unsettled the guards more than any scream could have. It came from a man kept on his knees only by chains bolted into a floor built for creatures twice his mass, in a cell lit by a cold violet glow that had no source anywhere Rourke could see. His wrists were raw. His left eye had swollen shut 2 days ago and stayed that way. He had stopped counting days after the 11th, not because he'd lost the will to count, but because counting implied he was waiting for something, and waiting was a kind of surrender he had decided he would not offer them. Somewhere above him, unseen, something vast breathed through the walls of the ship. He could feel it in his molars. He did not know yet that he was the only survivor of a scouting company of 41 soldiers. He did not know that the vessel holding him was 3 kilometers of armored hull older than his species' recorded history. He did not know that the empire which had captured him had never, in 11,000 years of expansion, lost a war against anyone. He knew only the cold floor, the ache in his shoulders, and the fact that he intended to still be refusing them when they finally decided to stop asking. That refusal, small and stubborn and entirely without strategic value, was the first thread in an unraveling that would end with an empire's confidence broken beyond repair. Nobody involved understood that yet, least of all him. He measured time now in the small, useless ways a body finds when the mind refuses to give it anything better. The cycle of the violet light dimming and brightening, though he suspected it followed no real day at all, just some rhythm designed to disorient. The rotation of guards, 4 of them, each with a different tell he'd learned without meaning to. The tall one who always paused half a second before opening the door, the quiet one who never met his eyes, the 2 who spoke to each other in low tones he couldn't translate and clearly didn't want understood. He cataloged these things not because he had a plan for them yet, but because cataloging was the only work left available to a mind that refused to go quiet just because its body had been chained to a floor. He thought sometimes about the last thing his company commander had said to him, back when there had still been a company, back before the cruiser's shields had turned 40 of his friends into names on a service record nobody on Earth had received yet. Whatever happens, they don't get to decide who you are. Only you get to decide that. It had sounded like the kind of thing officers said to make young soldiers feel steadier before a fight. Chained to a floor 3 weeks later, it had stopped sounding like a platitude and started sounding like the only instruction that mattered. His name was Elias Rourke, though for the first 30 seconds anyone listening to this account would have no way of knowing that, and it hardly mattered. Names are things species give each other when they've decided the other side is worth remembering. The Ashkir Dominion had not yet decided that about humanity. They were about to be forced to. The Dominion had a word for species like Rourke's before contact: unfinished. It was not a cruel word by their standards. It simply meant a civilization that had not yet been tested by war against something older than itself, and therefore had not yet proven it deserved a name worth using. Humanity, in the year the Dominion's outer picket fleet first crossed into what star charts on Earth called the Kess Corridor, was 11 years past its first faster-than-light jump and utterly unprepared for what it was about to meet. The first contact was not a battle. It was worse than a battle in the way that a diagnosis is worse than the injury itself, because a battle ends and a diagnosis simply begins a long, slow reckoning with what has been revealed. Ambassador Naomi Aldrich stood in a chamber built to make her feel small, and it worked, though she never once let it show on her face. The Dominion called the chamber the Hall of Uncontested Voices, a name so confident in its own permanence that translating it into any human language felt almost like an act of violence against the original meaning. Its ceiling rose 80 meters above her head into a lattice of black stone veined with faint blue light, and at the center of that vast emptiness stood a single dais, upon which the Ashkir called the first voice of the Dominion, a being named Threxa Val Asaic, waited with the patient stillness of something that had never once needed to hurry. She had prepared for this moment for 11 months, ever since the first long-range Dominion vessels had been detected skirting the edge of the Kess corridor, and human intelligence services had spent a frantic, quiet year Ying to determine exactly what they were looking at. 11 months of briefings, simulations, linguistic modeling built from fragments of intercepted Dominion communication, and none of it, standing here now beneath a ceiling built to remind her of her own smallness, felt like enough. She reminded herself of the things she'd told her staff on the shuttle over, that the size of the room was a tactic, not a truth, and that she was not required to believe everything a room told her simply because it was very good at telling it. Along the walls, arranged in tiers that rose toward the darkness above, stood perhaps 200 Dominion officials, administrators and military officers, none of them speaking, all of them watching with the particular stillness of a species that had never needed to perform attentiveness because nothing had ever required their urgency. Naomi found that stillness more unsettling than any hostility could have been. Hostility, at least, implied the other side considered you a threat worth reacting to. "You come to us," Threxa said, in the flat translated cadence the ship's systems produced, "without a fleet worth naming, without a war worth studying, and without the courtesy of understanding what you are asking of us." "We're not asking anything," Naomi said. "We're informing you that the systems along the Kess corridor are inhabited and claimed. We'd like a conversation about borders before this becomes something neither of us wants." Something in the chamber shifted, a ripple of amusement among the dozen or so high officials arranged along the walls, silent witnesses whose only role was to watch and remember. "A conversation about borders," Threxa repeated, and there was no mockery in the words themselves, only in the space around them. "You have met one species that has expanded beyond its home system in 11,000 years and lost. Do you know how many that is?" "I don't need the number to make my point." "0, Threxa said anyway. "There have been petitioners in this hall who arrived with war fleets 100 times the size of anything your species has built, and they left having agreed to terms. There have been petitioners who arrived with nothing but a plea, and they, too, left having agreed to terms. You have arrived with neither a fleet nor a plea, only words. I find that either very brave or very foolish, and I have not yet decided which." "Maybe it's neither," Naomi said. "Maybe it's just true. We're not leaving the corridor. We're not going to kneel to make that easier for you to accept. You can call that whatever word makes it easiest to explain to your own people." A being near the back of the hall, older than Threxa by the deference the others showed him, made a low sound that might have been a laugh in another body. His name, though no human would learn it for months, was Provost Kale Ithrace, and the sound he made was not amusement. It was appetite. "There is a simpler way to resolve this," Kale said, stepping forward without waiting for permission, a breach of protocol that no one in the chamber challenged. "Bring me the woman's ship. I will make an example that will save everyone a great deal of time." Threx's head turned, slow and deliberate. "That is not how this hall conducts itself, Provost." "It is how wars are shortened," Kale said, and something about the certainty in his voice, the total absence of doubt, made Naomi's skin go cold in a way that 11,000 years of Dominion confidence had not managed. Threxa did not answer him directly. Instead he turned back to Naomi, and for just a moment, so brief she would spend weeks afterward wondering if she'd imagined it, something in his posture looked almost like curiosity rather than dismissal. "You have 30 of your days," Threxa said. "Withdraw every vessel, every outpost, every claim from the corridor, or the Dominion will withdraw it for you. This is not a negotiation. It is a mercy we extend because you are new, and newness deserves one mercy before consequence. Do not mistake it for weakness." "We won't," Naomi said, But you should know we're not going to use it to pack our bags. Threxa studied her for a long moment, and something in the quality of his attention shifted, subtle enough that she almost missed it beneath the pounding of her own pulse. "You believe that," he said, not quite a question. "Not as a negotiating position. You actually believe you will still be here in 30 days. "I do." "Then either your species has a resource none of my analysts have detected," Threxa said, "or you are about to teach me something about the difference between confidence and delusion. I find I am curious which." "Ask me again in 30 days, Naomi said, echoing without knowing it. Words a chained soldier several systems away would say to a very different kind of interrogator in the weeks that followed. She left the hall with her spine straight and her hands steady, and it was not until she was back aboard her shuttle alone that she allowed herself to shake. 30 days. The Dominion assumed those 30 days would be spent in retreat, in the quiet business of a young species accepting its place in a much older order. They had no reason to assume otherwise. Every species they had ever tested had spent its mercy period exactly that way. They did not know about the Kestrel program. 4 years before Naomi Aldrich ever set foot in the Hall of Uncontested Voices, a joint human research consortium operating far beyond any charted trade route had begun assembling something that existed in no official registry, funded through channels so quiet that even most of Earth's government had no idea it was real. It began as a response to something far smaller than an empire, a single derelict vessel, drifting for who knew how many millennia in the black between systems, built from a material no human metallurgist could identify and powered by a drive architecture that made a mockery of everything humanity understood about propulsion. They called the derelict the Hollow Choir, because when the first survey team boarded it, their instruments picked up a faint resonance running through its bulkheads, a sound with no mechanical source, layered and harmonic, like something singing very slowly to itself in the dark. No one ever determined who built it, or when, or why it had been abandoned rather than destroyed. The engineers who studied it for 4 years came away with more questions than answers and exactly one usable breakthrough. A drive principle that let a ship translate across folded space without the gravitational signature every other faster-than-light method produced. It meant you could build a fleet, and no one watching the stars would see it coming. The engineer who led that 4-year effort, a soft-spoken propulsion specialist named Dr. Adiz Mbeki, would later describe the derelict's drive core, in the one interview she ever gave about it, as less like technology and more like a held breath, something built to wait a very long time for the right moment to exhale. She never fully explained what she meant by that, and most of her colleagues assumed it was simply the strain of 4 years spent staring into a mystery that refused to resolve into anything as comfortable as an answer. But the phrase stuck, quietly, among the small circle of people who knew what the Kestrel program actually was, and more than one officer aboard those 12 ships found themselves thinking of it in the months that followed, in moments when the whole endeavor felt less like a military strategy and more like something considerably stranger, a species borrowing patience from a civilization old enough to have forgotten it existed. The Kestrel program built 12 ships around that principle. They were not glamorous. They were not even, by most military logic, particularly powerful in raw output compared to a single Dominion capital ship. What they were was invisible, until the moment they chose not to be, and crewed by people who had spent 4 years training for exactly one kind of war, a war against something that had never once had to imagine losing. Fleet Commander Yusuf Bale was stood on the bridge of the lead vessel, a ship called the Whitfield's Oath, and watched the 30-day countdown Naomi Aldrich had relayed from the Hall of Uncontested Voices tick down on a display in the corner of his console. "They think we're going to run," said his second, a lieutenant commander named Priya Nandagopal. "They think a lot of things," Bale was said. "None of them have had to update their assumptions in 11,000 years, We're about to be an education. He did not say it with bravado. He said it the way a surgeon might describe a difficult procedure, with the flat calm of someone who understood exactly how much could still go wrong. Somewhere in the Kess corridor, unaware that any of this was happening, Elias Rourke was still on his knees. The scouting company he'd served with had been the first human unit the Dominion engaged directly, 3 weeks before Naomi Aldrich ever reached the Hall of Uncontested Voices, a border skirmish that the Dominion's local commander considered too minor to even report through proper channels. 41 soldiers against a single Dominion cruiser should not have been a fight at all, and by every measure the Dominion cared about, it wasn't. The cruiser's shield shrugged off everything the human dropship carried. What took longer than expected, what actually irritated the cruiser's captain enough to order boarding rather than simple annihilation, was that the humans kept fighting after every model the Dominion possessed said they should have surrendered. 40 of them died doing it. One did not, and the reason he did not was almost an accident. Cale Ithrace happened to be aboard that cruiser on an unrelated inspection, and something about the way Rourke kept getting back up interested him in the particular way a man who enjoys breaking things, is interested in something unusually difficult to break. "Bring that one to me alive," Cale had said, and so Rourke had spent the following weeks as the provost's private experiment in exactly how long it took to make a human kneel. It had not worked yet. Cale was becoming genuinely curious about why. "You could simply answer me," Cale said, on what Rourke had privately started calling Day 14, though he'd lost the actual count. "Tell me what breaks you and I will use it, and this will be finished quickly. You would prefer quickly." "You'd think that," Rourke said. His voice was wrecked, barely more than a rasp, but the words came out level. "But you don't actually want quick. You want to understand why it isn't working. That's the itch. I'm not going to scratch it for you." Cale's posture did not change, but something behind his eyes did. A flicker Rourke had learned to recognize over 2 weeks of study. The look of a predator whose prey had just said something unexpectedly interesting. "You are not exceptional," Cale said. "You understand that. Whatever this refusal, it is not strength. Strength is what I have. What you have is a delay before the inevitable." "Maybe," Rourke said. "Ask me again tomorrow." Cale crouched then, close enough that Rourke could feel the faint heat radiating off the plates along his jaw, a gesture that on a human face might have read as intimacy, but on Cale's read as something closer to a predator sizing the exact dimensions of something it intended to consume slowly. "I have done this to 11 species," Cale said, almost gently. "I have watched proud things kneel. Kings, generals. Once a mother who held out longer than any soldier I have ever broken, right up until I brought her child into the room, and then she found the floor very quickly indeed. Do you understand what I am telling you? I am not guessing at your limit. I am simply searching for it. Everyone has one. I have never once been wrong about that." "Then maybe I'm the first thing you've been wrong about," Rourke said. "Ever think about that? 11,000 years is a long time to go without meeting your own limit. Maybe you just got unlucky enough to still be alive when it finally showed up." Something flickered across Cale's face, gone almost as quickly as it arrived, and for the first time since the interrogations had begun, Rourke saw something in the provost's expression that was not appetite. It was closer to unease, small and buried and instantly suppressed. But Rourke had spent 3 weeks learning to read every twitch of muscle available to him, and he filed that flicker away like a soldier filing away the location of a weak point in an enemy line. He did not know it, but that same day, aboard the hollow quired-arrived vessels of the Kestrel program, Yusuf Bealwa gave the order that began the Dominion's first real education in what an unfinished species could do when it decided that dignity was not negotiable. I want to pause the story here for just a second, not to break the tension, but because it feels wrong to build something like this without saying it plainly. If you're finding your way into this one, sticking around for the rest of it means a lot. And if this is your first time here, the channel's a good place to land for more of these. Okay, Back into it, because things are about to get very loud. The Dominion's outer picket fleet at the edge of the Kess corridor consisted of 6 cruisers under the command of a fleet marshal named Corvassa Wren Delthier, a competent, unremarkable officer who had spent his entire career enforcing borders against species too weak to contest them. He had received no warning, because there was nothing to warn him about. The Kestrel program's ships did not register on any sensor architecture the Dominion possessed, right up until the moment Yusuf Beelwood decided they should. "Drop the veil," Beelwood said. "All ships now." 12 human vessels appeared in Dominion sensor range at a distance that should have taken hours to close, already inside the picket fleet's formation, weapons already tracking. Corvassa had roughly 4 seconds to process what his instruments were telling him before the Whitfield's oath put a precision strike through his flagship's engine core, disabling rather than destroying it, a choice that would matter enormously later, and that Corvassa, in the confusion of the moment, initially mistook for incompetence. It was not incompetence, it was doctrine. The Dominion fought the way an empire that has never lost fights, overwhelming force, applied without much subtlety, because subtlety had never once been necessary. Every human simulation of that doctrine over 4 years of preparation had confirmed the same thing, that meeting it head-on with equivalent force was a losing strategy no matter how good the equipment, because equivalent force played directly into 11,000 years of tactical certainty. So Th. Kestrel program had built something else, a doctrine of refusal. Refuse the terms of the engagement. Refuse to sit still long enough to be targeted the way Dominion gunnery assumed a target would sit still. Disable rather than destroy wherever possible, not from mercy alone, but because a crippled ship broadcasting its own helplessness back to Dominion command did more damage to 11,000 years of confidence than a destroyed one ever could. 4 Dominion cruisers were disabled within 11 minutes. 1 escaped. 1, whose captain refused to break off despite catastrophic damage, was destroyed only after every human ship in range had broadcast 3 separate warnings and received nothing back but continued fire. Corvassa Wren Delthier sat in the wreckage of his own bridge, alive, unhurt in any way that mattered, and stared at a tactical display that made no sense to him. 12 ships. 12 ships had done this, not through overwhelming force, through something his entire career had never trained him to recognize as a threat: patience, precision, and an absolute refusal to fight the fight he was prepared for. His weapons officer, a younger Ashkir named Trevik, kept replaying the engagement logs at half speed, as though slowing the footage down might reveal the trick, the sleight of hand that would restore some sense to what they just witnessed. "They had firing solutions on our reactor cores within the first 90 seconds, Trevik said, his voice tight with something between disbelief and a very old, very deep instinct beginning to recognize danger for the first time in his life. "They didn't take them. Look here and here again. They could have killed us all in the first minute. They chose not to." "I noticed," Corvassa said. "Why would they do that? We are the ones who came to enforce a border. By every doctrine we operate under, mercy in that position is a tactical error. It leaves an enemy alive to rebuild, to warn others too." "To tell exactly this story to everyone who will listen," Corvassa said quietly, understanding arriving with the slow, sick weight of a man watching a structure he trusted his whole life reveal a crack running through its foundation. "That is not an error, Trevik. That is the entire point. They didn't leave us alive by accident. They left us alive because a defeated fleet, broadcasting its own helplessness across every Dominion channel it can reach, does more work for them than our deaths ever could have. They are not fighting us. They are fighting the idea of us, and I do not know how to counter an idea with a war fleet." Trevik had no answer for that, and for a long moment the two of them sat in the wreckage of a bridge built by a civilization that had never needed to ask itself that particular question before, and said nothing at all. The message the Kestrel program broadcast afterward, on every frequency the Dominion used, was short. This is Fleet Commander Yusuf Bealwa of the Human Expeditionary Force. Your ships are disabled, not destroyed. Your crews are alive. We are not interested in your extermination. We are interested in you understanding, clearly and permanently, that the terms you offered our ambassador are no longer available. There will be no withdrawal from the corridor. There will be a conversation on equal footing, or there will be more of this. The choice is yours. It took the Dominion's High Command 4 days to fully process what had happened, not because the tactical situation was complicated, but because nothing in 11,000 years of institutional memory had prepared them to process a defeat that came wrapped in restraint. An enemy who could have destroyed 6 cruisers and chose to cripple 4 instead was, by every model the Dominion used to understand threat, either catastrophically weak or operating from a position of such confidence that mercy cost them nothing. The uncertainty over which of those it was did more damage to Dominion morale than the battle itself. Threxa Val Asaic watched the recovered engagement footage 17 times before he spoke to anyone about it. They had 6 ships disabled and 1 destroyed, said an aide, a younger official named Sethvi who had never known the Dominion to lose anything. We could deploy the 3rd Armada within the week. This is not a defeat, first voice. It is a single skirmish. It is not the skirmish that concerns me, Threxa said. It is the choice. Look again at which ships they destroyed and which they spared. It was not random and it was not weakness. They chose the one captain who refused to stop, and they let the rest live specifically to carry the story home. That is not the behavior of an unfinished species. That is the behavior of something that has already decided what kind of war it intends to fight, and has decided that on purpose. What kind of war is that? The kind we have never had to fight, Threxa said, because we have never lost enough to need one. Provost Kale I. Thrace, when he received the same report, reacted very differently. Good, he said, to no one in particular, standing over Elias Rourke's cell with something in his expression that Rourke, even through a swollen eye, recognized instantly as danger. Now I understand what I've been missing. You people don't break under pain because pain isn't the thing you're afraid of losing. You're catching on slow, Rourke said. Then I will simply need to be more specific, Kale said, and left without another word, and something about the quality of his silence made Rourke's stomach tighten in a way 2 weeks of chains had not managed. He learned what Kale meant 3 days later when the cell door opened and 2 guards brought in a second prisoner, a woman in a torn Dominion research uniform, hands bound, clearly terrified, clearly not military. She was Ashkir. Rourke didn't understand at first why that mattered, until Kale arrived behind her and explained, almost pleasantly, that she was a junior archivist who had spent the last several years cataloging precursor ruined sites along the corridor's edge, and that her only crime, as far as Rourke could tell, was having been nearby when Kale needed a demonstration. You've shown me pain doesn't move you, Kale said. Let's discover whether watching it does. Vessa's eyes found Rourke's, and for a moment neither of them said anything at all. She was young, younger than he'd first assumed beneath the fear, and something about the careful, deliberate way she held herself, chin up despite the shaking in her hands, told him she was trying very hard to give Kale as little as she could, even now. He recognized the effort because it was the same effort he'd been making for 3 weeks straight, and something about seeing it mirrored in a stranger's face, an Ashkir stranger's face, of all things, hit him harder than anything Kale had done to him directly. This is beneath you, Rourke said, though he had no idea in that moment whether it actually was, whether an empire that had never lost a war had any concept of beneath at all. You've got the whole apparatus of an empire behind you, and you need to hurt someone who catalogs old ruins for a living to get a reaction out of me. That's not power. That's a man who ran out of better ideas. This account of what happened aboard the Unbroken Testament that day would later become, in the months following the tribunal, one of the most disputed details in the entire record, because Kale Ithrace's own logs, recovered afterward, described the encounter very differently, framing it as a controlled test of variables rather than what witnesses on both sides eventually agreed it actually was. The first crack, however small, in a certainty that had never once needed defending before. What Cale had not accounted for, what nothing in his 11,000 years of certainty had prepared him to predict, was that the archivist herself would refuse to play the role he'd assigned her. Her name was Vesa Oren Thale, and though she was shaking, though she was clearly and understandably afraid, she looked at Rourke with something that was not pleading. It was apology. "I did not choose this," she said, in halting but functional Dominion standard, the translator implant in Rourke's ear rendering it clean and flat. "I want you to know that." "I know," Rourke said. "Don't give him what he wants either." Cale's hand found the base of Vesa's neck, and something in his grip made clear exactly how far he intended to go, and Rourke, chained, exhausted, half-blind, did the only thing left available to him. He started talking fast, aiming every word directly at Cale, because he understood with total clarity that the only leverage he had left was making himself, not her, the more interesting target. "You want to know what breaks me," he said. "Fine. It's not this. Watching you hurt someone who never did anything to either of us doesn't break me. It tells me exactly what you are. It tells me you already know I won't kneel, so you need someone else's pain to do the kneeling for me because you can't stand the idea that maybe it just isn't going to happen. That's not strength. That's a man who's terrified of finding his own limit." For a long moment, Cale said nothing. Then, with a stillness more frightening than any outburst, he released Vesa's neck. "Take her back to her quarters," he told the guards. "This one is still useful." It was not mercy. Rourke understood that even as it happened. It was recalculation, the same recalculation playing out across the entire Dominion in the days following the battle at the picket line. An old certainty running headfirst into something it had no framework for, and choosing, in the moment, to gather more data rather than act on instinct. But whatever Cale's reasons, Vesa Oren Thale left that cell alive, and something about the way she looked back at Rourke as the guards led her out told him this was not the last he would see of her. He was right. 9 days later, in the deep hours of the ship's cycle when the corridor outside his cell should have been empty, the door opened without a guard's authorization, and Vesa slipped inside alone, carrying a data key and a look of someone who had spent 9 sleepless nights arguing herself into a decision she was terrified of. "I have spent 6 years cataloging precursor sites in this corridor," she whispered, working at the lock mechanism on his chains with shaking hands. "Ruins older than the Dominion itself. We do not understand them. We have never understood them. And in 6 years I have never once seen my people encounter something they could not eventually break, absorb, or outlast. Until now, I do not know what you are. But I know what he is, and I am done pretending that is acceptable simply because it is familiar." "Why help me?" Rourke asked, because even freedom felt like it deserved an honest question. "Because you told the truth to a man who has spent his career making sure no one ever does," Vesa said. "I would like to see what happens when more people do the same." She could not get him off the ship. She was not that kind of operative, and the Dominion's flagship, the vast and ancient vessel called the Unbroken Testament, was not the kind of place a research archivist could simply walk a prisoner out of. What she could do was get him free of his chains, get him a weapon salvaged from a maintenance locker, and get him access to a service corridor that ran, she believed, close enough to the ship's secondary reactor conduits to cause meaningful damage if a person knew what they were doing, and did not particularly value their own survival in the doing of it. Rourke knew what he was doing. 4 years in a demolitions unit before he'd ever transferred to the scouting company had made sure of that. What followed was not a single dramatic sequence, so much as 11 brutal hours of a single exhausted, malnourished, half-blind human moving through the guts of a 3-kilometer warship, built by a civilization 11,000 years more experienced at war than his own, using nothing but a stolen sidearm, stolen tools, and an intimate, furious understanding of exactly how badly he wanted every person aboard that ship to understand what it felt like to lose control of something they had never once imagined losing. He moved slowly at first, every joint screaming, stopping twice in the first hour just to breathe through waves of dizziness that threatened to put him back on the floor for good. He was not a soldier built for stealth. He was a demolition specialist who had spent 4 years learning exactly how much a structure could take before it stopped being a structure at all, and he applied that knowledge now the only way available to him, not with grand sabotage, but with small, deliberate cruelties against a ship that had spent centuries assuming nothing small could ever touch it. A coolant line here bled slow enough that no automated system flagged it until the damage was already done. A relay junction there, rewired with fingers that shook so badly it took him 4 attempts to get the connection right. Each success bought him another hour. Each hour brought him deeper into a ship whose crew was only beginning to understand that something was wrong. Twice he was nearly caught. The first time, a maintenance drone rounded a corner ahead of him, and he froze against a bulkhead in the dark, certain the automated systems would flag his heat signature and end everything before it had properly begun. And it did not. Some quirk of the drone's routine or some mercy of Dominion engineering he would never fully understand, and he let himself feel the relief for exactly 3 seconds before moving on. The second time was worse. A 2-person patrol, close enough that he could hear them speaking, close enough that he had to make a choice in less than a second between the sidearm and the dark, and he chose the dark, flattening himself into a service alcove barely large enough to hold him, holding his breath until his vision swam, and they walked past without ever knowing how close they'd come to a fight neither of them was prepared for. By the 9th hour, he had stopped being careful in any way that mattered. He was moving on while alone, blood loss and exhaustion narrowing his vision to a tunnel that held only the next junction, the next charge, the next system he could turn against the people who had spent 3 weeks turning everything they had against him. It was not strategy anymore, not really. It was something closer to a promise he was keeping to himself, one wrecked breath at a time. He did not destroy the unbroken testament. That was never the plan, and it was never possible, not with one man and a handful of charges against a ship that size. What he did was worse, in the specific way that mattered. He crippled its long-range communication array, blinded 3 of its primary sensor eyes, and set fire, quite literally, to a supply deck responsible for feeding 2/3 of the crew. And he did it all while broadcasting, on a frequency Vesa had helped him access. A single message looping over and over through every internal speaker on the ship, in his own wrecked voice, translated automatically into Dominion Standard by the very systems built to keep prisoners compliant. My name is Elias Rourke. I am one man. I have been in a cell on this ship for 3 weeks. This is what one of us can do to you when you decide our lives don't matter. Imagine what the rest of us are going to do. By the time Dominion security finally cornered him, 4 decks down, out of ammunition, bleeding from a dozen places, he had accomplished something no single prisoner in the Dominion's entire 11,000-year history had ever managed. He had made an ancient empire's flagship feel, for 11 hours, exactly as small and exposed as every species the Dominion had ever conquered had once felt in the face of it. They did not kill him. Cale Ithrace gave the order himself, and for once his reasons were not curiosity but something closer to fury, the particular fury of a man who has just discovered his own methods produced the opposite of what he intended. "He dies when I decide he dies," Cale said, "and not one moment sooner." What Cale did not know, could not have known, was that the message Rourke broadcast through the Unbroken Testament's internal systems had also, through a service uplink Vesa had quietly routed weeks earlier without fully understanding why she was doing it, bled out onto a wider Dominion communications relay, the same relay that fed status updates back to the Hall of Uncontested Voices. Threxa Val Asaic heard it within the hour. So did every officer, every archivist, every low-ranking crew member across a dozen Dominion vessels who happened to be listening at the wrong moment. And so, 3 days later, thanks to a merchant vessel with loose lips and looser data security, did every human ship in the Kestrel program's growing operational network. Yusuf Bealwa played the recording on the Whitfield's Oath's bridge in total silence. "Find that ship," he said when it finished. "Find our man." It took 11 more days. In that time, the Dominion's high command, badly shaken by a battle they could not fully explain and a security failure aboard their flagship they could explain even less, made the decision that would ultimately cost Kale Ithrace everything. Rather than quietly disposing of an increasingly troublesome prisoner, they chose to make an example of him, publicly, broadcasting a tribunal-style execution across Dominion channels, as a demonstration that the corridor's new arrivals had not, in fact, broken anything at all. It was, in hindsight, the single greatest miscalculation in the Dominion's 11,000-year history, because it told every human ship listening exactly where and when Elias Rourke would be. The full human mobilization that followed was not the quiet, patient doctrine of the Kestrel program's earlier engagement. It was something rawer, faster, and far larger, because in the 11 days since the picket line battle, word of both the victory and the broadcast recording had reached every corner of human space, and what had begun as a small, secret project became, almost overnight, a unified war effort the likes of which the species had never assembled. 40 additional vessels, built in yards that had been quietly preparing for exactly this contingency, since the hollow choir's drive principle was first understood, folded into the Kess corridor within a week. This was no longer 12 ships proving a point. This was a fleet. It was not only ships. Within 72 hours of the recording reaching civilian networks, recruitment stations across every major human settlement reported queues that stretched for city blocks, a swell of volunteers that planetary defense coordinators had neither expected nor, in the first chaotic days, fully known how to process. Not all of it was noble. Some of it was fear, some of it was fury, some of it was the simple human reflex to close ranks around a wound that had been broadcast into every household on the planet. But beneath the noise, something steadier took hold as well. A recognition, spreading faster than any official messaging could have engineered it, that the 11 soldiers who had recorded that first skirmish's final transmissions, and the 40 who never made it home, and the one who had turned an empire's flagship into a fire he lit with his bare hands, deserved a response equal to what they'd given. Yusuf Bealwa found himself, in those 11 days, commanding something he had never trained to command. Not a strike force anymore, but the leading edge of an entire civilization's answer to a question it had never expected to be asked this early in its history. He slept in 2-hour intervals when he slept at all, and more than NCE caught himself staring at the growing tactical display on the Whitfield's Oath's bridge, 40 ships, and then 50, and then, as reserve yards finished hulls that had sat half-built for contingencies nobody had believed would actually arrive, 60, and thinking that the hardest part of this entire war might not be the fighting at all. It might be making sure that all this speed, all this righteous and understandable fury, didn't outrun the doctrine that had made the first battle mean something. "We don't get to become a mob just because we finally have the numbers to be one," he told his assembled captains, 2 days before the operation that would become Rourke's rescue. "Every ship in this fleet fights the way the first 12 fought, or you don't fly under my banner. I don't care how angry you are. Angry is easy. Precise is hard. We're going to be precise." The execution broadcast was scheduled to take place aboard the Unbroken Testament itself, in a public amphitheater deck built centuries ago for exactly this purpose, ringed by observation platforms crowded with Dominion officials eager to watch the corridor's troublesome new species put back in its place. Elias Rourke was brought out in chains, barely able to stand, and forced to his knees before Cale Ithrace's raised platform in front of several thousand watching eyes, human and Dominion both, the broadcast running live across every channel either species controlled. "Kneel," Cale said, for what both of them understood to be the final time, "and I will make this quick. Refuse, and I will make it a lesson every species in this corridor remembers for the next 1,000 years." Rourke lifted his head. His voice, when it came, was barely more than a whisper, but the amphitheater's systems carried it to every corner of the deck and every screen watching from light years away. "I already told you, I don't kneel because you can hurt me. I don't kneel at all." What happened next happened almost too fast for the cameras to properly track. The amphitheater's ceiling, 300 meters of reinforced Dominion armor plating, buckled inward under a strike so precise, it disabled almost nothing beyond the deck's own defensive systems. A controlled breach executed by a human strike team that had spent the better part of a week planning exactly how to extract one man from the heart of an Empire's flagship, without triggering the kind of retaliatory destruction that would have made the rescue meaningless. The strike team that executed the breach was small by design, 8 soldiers under the command of a captain named Deja Marsh, chosen specifically because Bale's doctrine demanded precision over mass, and every one of them had spent the preceding week memorizing schematics of the Unbroken Testament's amphitheater deck, reconstructed from fragments of the same broadcast feed that had revealed Rourke's location in the first place. They dropped through the breach on tethers, into a crowd of several thousand panicked Dominion officials, and moved with a discipline that later analysis would credit as much to restraint as to speed. No weapon fired except to disable, no path cleared through violence that could instead be cleared through the simple, overwhelming shock of an armored human soldier, moving exactly where the enemy did not expect one to be. Marsh reached Rourke first, cutting through the last of his restraints with a blade meant for far tougher material than Dominion binding cable, and found a man barely conscious, blood loss and exhaustion having taken nearly everything he had left to give. "Corporal Rourke," she said, hauling his arm across her shoulders, "you're late for extraction." "Took your time," he managed, and it was the last thing he remembered saying before the ascent tether pulled them both back up through the breach and into the relative sanity of the Whitfield's Oath's boarding bay. The Whitfield's Oath itself did not fire a single weapon into that amphitheater. Yusuf Bale was standing order, relayed to every ship in the fleet before the operation began, was unambiguous. No civilian casualties, no unnecessary destruction, minimum force required to extract Rourke and no more. It was a doctrine that made the extraction harder, slower, and considerably more dangerous for the soldiers executing it. And Bale held the line on it anyway, because the entire war, as far as he was concerned, had never actually been about winning a fight. It had been about proving there was a difference between winning and becoming the thing you were fighting. Cale Ithrace did not survive the extraction, not because any human soldier killed him, but because in the chaos of the breach, as his own guards scrambled to control a situation none of them had trained for, he made the decision to personally finish what he'd started, drawing a blade against a chained, barely conscious prisoner in full view of a fleet of cameras still broadcasting to both empires. It was Threxaval, Osaic's own security detail, dispatched understanding orders that predated the entire conflict, that stopped him, and in the confusion of that moment, Cale Ithrace died by Dominion hands rather than human ones, a fact that would matter enormously to everything that followed. Rourke was extracted alive, barely but alive. What came after was not, contrary to every expectation on both sides, a war that escalated into extermination. The full mobilization the Dominion expected, the overwhelming retaliatory force their doctrine demanded, never fully materialized, because in the days following the broadcast, something began happening across the Dominion that 11,000 years of unbroken victory had never required anyone to consider: internal dissent. Officials who had watched Kale Ithrace's methods for years with quiet discomfort found themselves, for the first time, with a public, undeniable example of exactly where that discomfort led. Vesa Oren Thale, far from facing punishment for her role in Rourke's escape, found herself instead approached by a coalition of archivists, junior officials, and even a handful of senior officers who had reached, independently and simultaneously, the same conclusion she had: that the Dominion's confidence had curdled, somewhere in 11,000 years of never losing, into something closer to cruelty than strength, and that the humans, whatever else they were, had just demonstrated with painful clarity that the two were not the same thing. In the weeks between Rourke's rescue and the tribunal's opening session, Dominion investigators, working under Threx's direct authority and against the open resistance of officials still loyal to the old certainties, uncovered records that had sat quietly buried in Kale Ithrace's administrative history for decades. A pattern consistent across three separate subject worlds of interrogation methods that had produced confessions and compliance at a cost the Dominion's own internal reviewers, at the time, had chosen not to examine too closely, because the results had always been useful, and the species involved had never possessed the standing to be believed even if they'd complained. One world, a quiet agricultural system called Osran that had surrendered without resistance 3 centuries earlier, had lost what its own surviving elders described, in testimony gathered for the first time in the tribunal's preparation, as an entire generation of its intellectual and spiritual leadership to interrogations Kale had personally overseen during what Dominion records blandly termed a compliance verification period. It was this discovery, more than anything done to Rourke directly, that shifted the tribunal from a narrow question about the treatment of one human prisoner into something the Dominion had never before been forced to confront about itself. Not an isolated cruelty, but a pattern, tolerated and quietly rewarded for centuries, because no one with sufficient standing had ever survived to make it visible. Threxa Val Asaic convened a tribunal. Not a trial for the humans, as the Dominion's high command initially assumed he intended, but an internal reckoning, the first in the Dominion's recorded history, into the conduct of one of its own. Naomi Aldrich was invited to attend, an unprecedented gesture that several Dominion officials openly opposed. She went anyway, and sat in a gallery of the Hall of Uncontested Voices that had never once, in 11,000 years, held a representative of a species the Dominion had not already conquered, and watched as evidence of Kale Ithrace's conduct, not just toward Rourke, but toward a long, quiet history of similar cruelties against a dozen other subject species, was laid bare before the very officials who had spent decades looking away from it. It was, by Naomi's count, the third day of testimony before Vesa Oren Thale herself was called to speak, and when she rose from the gallery to take the small raised platform reserved for witnesses, Naomi watched something ripple through the assembled officials that she recognized instantly, because she had felt its human equivalent more than once in her own career. The particular discomfort of watching someone junior, someone who was supposed to be invisible, refuse to stay that way. "I cataloged ruins for 6 years," Vesa said, her voice steady despite what it clearly cost her to keep it that way. "I was taught that the Dominion's strength was proven by its permanence, that 11,000 years without defeat was itself a kind of moral argument, that we had earned the right to decide what mercy looked like for everyone beneath us, because we had never needed anyone else's mercy in return. I believed that for most of my life. I stopped believing it in a cell, watching a chained man tell a provost the truth, rather than let it be used against someone innocent. I do not know what that makes me. I know it means I cannot sit in this hall and pretend I did know. See what I saw." Several officials pressed her afterward, not unkindly but firmly, on whether her account might be colored by sympathy for a prisoner she had chosen to help, whether 6 days of proximity to a compelling human narrative might have shaped her memory of events that had happened weeks earlier. Threxa Val Asaic, presiding, allowed the questioning to run its course without interruption, and when it finished, asked only one question of his own. "Was there a moment," he said, "in which you could have said nothing, done nothing, and simply continued your work as you always had, secure and unremarked upon?" "Every moment," Vesa said. "That was the entire point of staying silent for 6 years. It was always available to me." "And yet you did not take it." "No." Threxa said nothing further, but the silence that followed carried more weight in that hall than any verdict he might have spoken aloud. It would have been easy, and by conventional military logic entirely justified, for the human delegation to press for something harsher: reparations, humiliation, a public accounting that matched the scale of what had been done to Rourke and to countless others before him. There were voices within the human command structure, including some aboard the Whitfield's Oath itself, who argued exactly that. Yusuf Balewa was not one of them. "We didn't fight this war to become better at cruelty than they were," he said, in a private council held aboard the flagship before the tribunal's final session. "We fought it so nobody else has to prove they deserve mercy before they're given the chance to ask for it. If we walk into that hall and demand blood because we finally have the power to take it, we haven't won anything. We've just changed which species gets to be afraid." It was Elias Rourke himself, still recovering, still weeks from being able to stand without support, who was asked to address the tribunal, and it was his words, more than any official human position, that shaped what came after. "He wanted to break me because breaking things was the only kind of power he understood," Rourke said, his voice carried by the same systems that had once broadcast his defiance to an entire empire. "I'm not going to ask you to break him back. That's not a victory. That's just proof he was right about what power is. I'd rather you prove him wrong." The Dominion's tribunal did not execute anyone. It stripped Cale Ithrace's name, posthumously, from every honor his family had held for 6 generations, a punishment that within Dominion culture carried a weight no human present fully understood until Vesa Oren Thale, sitting quietly beside Naomi Aldrich, explained afterward that it was, for the Dominion, close to the harshest consequence their society recognized. Not death, but erasure, the thing that came for someone once every other punishment had failed to teach the lesson cruelty itself refused to learn. The peace that followed was not immediate, and it was not simple. It took the better part of 2 years to formalize into anything resembling a treaty, years spent in halls far less grand than the Hall of Uncontested Voices, where human and Ashkir negotiators argued, compromised, occasionally shouted, and slowly built something neither species had ever needed before. A border respected not because one side had crushed the other into accepting it, but because both sides had, in their own ways, been forced to reckon with exactly what they were willing to become in order to win. There were setbacks. A Dominion faction loyal to the old doctrine, embarrassed by the tribunal's outcome, and unwilling to accept that 11,000 years of certainty had been meaningfully shaken by a single corridor skirmish, attempted twice in the first year to reignite hostilities through smaller, deniable provocations along the border. Both times, Yusuf Balewa's fleet responded with the same doctrine that had defined the war from its first engagement: precise, restrained, and pointedly unwilling to escalate beyond what the provocation itself demanded, a choice that cost him political capital at home among voices who wanted a harder answer, and that he defended, every time, with the same argument. "If we let them provoke us into becoming the empire we just spent a war refusing to become," he told a closed session of human military command, "then Cale Ithrace wins anyway. He just doesn't have to be alive to do it." There were also, in those 2 years, smaller and stranger signs of something shifting beneath the formal negotiations. Ashkir scholars began, quietly at first and then with growing openness, requesting access to human philosophical and legal texts, curious about a species that had built entire frameworks of governance around the idea that power required restraint to remain legitimate. Human students, in turn, found themselves drawn to Dominion history in numbers no university had anticipated, less interested in the 11,000 years of conquest than in the 11,000 years of stories. The Dominion told itself to make that conquest feel inevitable, and what it might mean that those stories were now, for the first time, being questioned from within. Threxa Val Asaic, in the final session of those negotiations, said something that Naomi Aldrich would carry with her for the rest of her life. We believed, for 11,000 years, that peace was simply the shape victory eventually took, once resistance had been exhausted. You have shown us it can be a choice, made while resistance is still possible, and that the choosing is not a lesser thing than the winning. I do not know what to do with that yet. I suspect my people will be learning what to do with it for a very long time. The hollow choir was never fully explained. Vesa Oren-Thale spent the rest of her career, and much of it in close collaboration with human archaeologists, trying to determine who had built it, and why, and what the strange layered resonance running through its bulkheads had once meant to whoever left it drifting in the dark between systems. She never found an answer. Neither, decades later, did anyone who came after her. It remained exactly what it had been from the beginning, a question too old for either species to fully claim, a reminder, if either of them needed one, that there were older, stranger things in the dark than either empire's certainty about its own permanence. Elias Rourke did not become a general, or a politician, or anything the stories that grew up around him afterward tended to suggest. He recovered slowly from injuries that never fully left him, and he spent most of the years that followed doing something almost aggressively unremarkable, teaching new recruits in a small training facility on the edge of human space that the point of every doctrine he'd helped prove in the Kess corridor was never really about winning fights. It was about deciding, ahead of time, exactly what kind of person you intended to still be once the fight was over. He turned down, in the 2 years following the treaty's signing, offers that would have made him wealthy, offers that would have made him famous beyond anything he already involuntarily was, offers from 3 separate publishers wanting the authorized account of his 11 hours aboard the Unbroken Testament. He gave exactly one interview, brief and reluctant, to a journalist who had tracked him down at the training facility against considerable resistance from the facility's staff. And when she asked him why he refused every other request, he gave an answer that made the eventual short piece considerably less dramatic than her editors had hoped for. Because the story people want isn't the one that actually matters, he said. They want the 11 hours, the fire, the ship, all of it. That part's over. It was over the day it happened. What actually matters is what a person does with the next 30 years after everybody stops watching. Nobody wants to read about that part. It's boring. It's also the only part I've got left to get right. Vesa Oren-Thale visited him twice in those years, on both occasions accompanied by university colleagues eager to see, in person, the man whose broadcast had helped unravel 11,000 years of certainty. And both times Rourke seemed faintly embarrassed by the attention, more interested in asking after her research into the hollow choir than in discussing anything either of them had lived through together. You were the one who actually did something difficult, he told her the second time over a meal neither of them finished because they were both talking too much to eat. I just refused to kneel. You had to decide to stop being safe. That's harder. I've thought about it a lot since. We could argue about whose choice mattered more for the rest of our lives, Vesa said, and I suspect we would never agree, and I suspect that is exactly as it should be. I was 19 when I met him, 5 years after the treaty was signed, working maintenance on the training facility's transport bay, a job I'd taken because I didn't have anywhere better to be and because the pay covered rent. I didn't know when I started that the quiet man who showed up most mornings to run drills with the new recruits was the same one from all those old broadcasts, the ones my mother used to replay when I was a kid, the ones everyone had a copy of somewhere even a decade later. He never talked about any of it unless someone asked directly, and even then, only a little. I remember the first time I realized who he was. It wasn't dramatic. He was helping me replace a coolant seal on one of the transport shuttles, handing me tools before I'd even asked for them because he'd apparently done this exact job himself more times than he could count, back before any of what made him famous had happened to him. And I made some offhand comment about how steady his hands were for someone his age, and he laughed, actually laughed, and said something about how they used to shake a lot worse than this, once, and something in the way he said it made me look at him properly for the first time. I went home that night and pulled up the old broadcast, the one my mother used to play, and sat there with my stomach in knots realizing I'd spent 3 weeks handing tools to a man half the galaxy still argued about. I never told him I'd watched it. Somehow it felt like it would have embarrassed us both. Instead, I just kept showing up, and he kept showing up, and over the better part of a year, I got to know him the way you get to know anyone you work alongside quietly for long enough. Not through the big questions, but through the small ones. What he took in his coffee, which recruits he worried about and which ones he didn't. The particular, careful way he always made sure new arrivals understood their mistakes without ever once making them feel small for having made them. A patience I didn't understand the full weight of until years later. When I finally put together everything, he must have survived to have any patience left at all. I asked him once, near the end of my time there, whether he ever regretted not asking for more when he had the chance, back at that tribunal, when an entire empire was ready to give him whatever he wanted. He thought about it for longer than I expected. I got everything I actually needed, he said. I got to still recognize myself when it was over. That's not nothing. That's actually the whole thing if you ask me, though it took me a long time and a lot of chains to figure that out. He passed a scar on his left forearm, old and pale, without seeming to notice he was doing it, the way people do with the parts of themselves they've stopped being surprised by. Strength was never the hard part, he said. Any fool can be strong for an afternoon if someone hands him a good enough reason. Staying gentle after you've already won, when nobody could stop you if you didn't, that's the part almost nobody trains for. That's the part worth remembering, if you're going to remember any of it at all. I think about that more than I think about the battles, honestly, even now, all these years later. Everyone remembers the fleet, and the flagship, and the man who walked out of a cage that was built by a civilization 11,000 years older than his own, and somehow proved it couldn't hold him. But what I remember, what I actually carry with me from those quiet mornings in the transport bay, is a tired man with an old scar telling a 19-year-old that the hardest fight he ever won was the one where nobody was left to fight. And he still had to choose, every single day after, not to become the thing he'd spent so long refusing to kneel to. I don't know if that's the ending anyone expects from a story like this, but it's the true one as far as I ever got close enough to see it, and it's the one I still find myself telling, on quiet nights, to anyone who asks what really happened out there in the corridor all those years ago, when one man refused to kneel and an empire slowly, reluctantly, finally learned what that refusal was worth.